Sam Greene is professor in Russian politics at King's College, London. Prior to moving to London in 2012, joined King's, he lived and worked in Moscow for 13 years, most recently as the director of the Centre for the Study of New Media and Society at the New Economic School, and as deputy director of the Carnegie Moscow Centre. He holds a PhD in political sociology from the London School of Economics and Politics. We did an interview, it's now more than a year, perhaps even two ago, with his co-author, Graeme Robertson, of a fantastic book called Putin and the People. We are going to cover a little bit of that ground in the second half of this interview. The first half, we're going to be looking at the rapidly changing geopolitical situation vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, Europe, the transatlantic alliance, etc., etc. Thank you to everybody who engages with the channel and especially supports the work we do. As many of you will know, we are still crowdsourcing to try and get trucks to send over to Ukraine, 4x4s, which are absolutely essential. I will also be attending the Lviv Media Forum. So this is the next in the series of grand events that we're doing. Lots of interviews on the ground, and we'll be traveling also to Kiev and Odessa as part of that. As you all know as well, this stuff costs money. So thank you to everyone who supported that and continues to support it via Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Links in the description of the video. Sam, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Well, thanks for having me on. Sorry it's taken so long.
We've been exchanging messages for some time, but of course, anticipation means that when it does happen, of course, it's fantastic. This is an interview in two halves, basically. We're going to start talking about the sort of what's happening on the geopolitical scale, and then turn back to the book. And of course, if people are interested, are fascinated in, Russian internal politics and how we got where we are, as well as what's going to happen next, then of course your book comes highly recommended, and we'll put the link to that in the description. But let's start your comment recently on I think it was LinkedIn and Twitter, and that is that Europe has become a new battleground, in fact, that is the center of huge tectonic shifts, with blocks that are increasingly starting to behave, I would say, as imperialistic blocks with an imperial mindset. That, of course, includes China, Russia, and the US, unfortunately. What are your impressions of this change in fundamental geopolitics?
Well, I think it's important to recognize the parts of this that actually are changing and the parts of it that are not, right? So if we take the conflict with Russia, the conflict really that Russia has thrown itself into and in many ways provoked in recent years, whether we date that back to 2022, 2014, or 2008, indeed, with the invasion of Georgia. Or I suppose we go back to 2007 and Putin's famous Munich speech, right, at which he talked about really thrusting Russia into a very different kind of geopolitical position vis-a-vis the West, and in fact vis-a-vis the US in particular, the way he framed it at the time. I think we analytically and sort of in the public debate have always tended to see Europe as standing to a certain extent aside from that. Europe institutionally has liked to see itself as standing aside from that. Europe's vision of itself historically has been as a non-geopolitical entity, right? That Europe was created to end geopolitics, right? And to create these non-zero sum logics that would benefit everybody in terms of peace, prosperity, stability, and just genuine and general human progress. And a lot of credit to that, right? It ended wars between major European powers, at least those who were in the European Union. It did create a lot of prosperity, stability, and with some caveats. Obviously, sitting here in Britain, it's difficult for most people living in Europe to imagine themselves living outside of Europe. And even those of us who've decided to take ourselves outside of Europe sometimes struggle to imagine exactly how we're going to make that work. But I think all of that has tended to elide the reality that Europe is a geopolitical project, right? And that the way in which Europe has sought to create stability, peace, and prosperity for itself, and arguably for its neighbors, is predicated on a certain model of governance, a certain model of how you manage your politics and your economy. And if you don't run your country that way, if you choose to run your country the way that Russia has chosen to run its country, at least since Vladimir Putin came to power in 1999 and 2000, Europe can, in many ways, actually feel very threatening. And so, even though the rhetoric has mostly been, and we can get into exactly, what Putin's learning process has been, but even though the rhetoric has historically been about confrontation between Moscow and Washington, the reality is that when Russia really concertedly put the force of arms behind its geopolitical stance in 2014, it did so in response to a European deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, right? Not in response to NATO, not in response to something that the US was doing, but in response to Europe. We've latterly seen the emergence of what looks like maybe a situational coalition between Washington and Moscow that is very much challenging and isolating for Europe. And that, to a certain extent, is obviously new. We see a very new dynamic in Washington, but the fundamental dynamic between Moscow and Europe is one that has been there for a very long time and has been growing in severity for a very long time.
Isn't one of the challenges as well that even if Europe isn't aware of its geopolitical projection or only has a quasi sort of consciousness of it, it's a natural process. I mean, the values and the material wealth that it creates, and you see that in action on the Polish border, 30 years of the sort of governance and rule of law that you mentioned there, it has a material impact. So
Sure.
even if it wasn't projecting itself forward in terms of hard power, there is a kind of organic power, an organic attraction of these values, which of course Ukraine has been sort of, I wouldn't say tearing itself apart because that's actually, not accurate, but certainly Ukraine has been drifting towards it and quite naturally because it wants those things. And many Ukrainians want the stability and the material wealth and innovation that is unlocked by having a different system of governance, different values. And many Ukrainians in the West, of course, will say that it's perfectly natural and there's a historical continuity there, which Russia doesn't have as well. So are there other forces here of, let's say, sort of liberal economic values, democracy, if you want to put a label on it, versus essentially the Russian system of governance, which is very, very different, sort of physically, psychologically, politically?
Well, even if you leave the history and the psychology out of it, I think there is a stark choice between how you create and distribute wealth and prosperity in an economy. Right? You can develop a system, and look, I don't want to overstate the quality of EU governance. Right? It is challenging and developing over time. It's certainly far from perfect, but it is predicated on it quite explicitly predicated on a system in which governments don't pick winners, right? In which you have regulated but sort of dispassionately regulated markets in which people create opportunities and wealth through essentially a liberal capitalist mode. Now we can discuss what the pros and cons of that might be, right? But that's very different from a system in which in Russia, now this is not a socialist system in which the system is the government is trying to create equality for people. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The government is picking winners on the basis of political expediency and loyalty, is creating tremendous amounts of market concentration of political and economic power, concentration of wealth at the upper end of the political economic food chain, is using that to insulate itself from pressure from below. So if you are a citizen of Ukraine, a citizen of Moldova, a citizen of Georgia, indeed, in many cases, if you're a citizen of Russia, right, and you look at these two options, right, and try to make a decision about, well, which is likeliest to create the kind of society that you want to live in, the kind of economy that you want to live in, that's going to give your children the mobility that you want for them so that they can live a better life than you have coming out of the dislocation and the difficulties of the 1990s and early 2000s, the entirety really of the post-Soviet period. It's maybe not a very difficult choice. And so I would resist a little bit. I think you talked about Ukraine as drifting towards Europe. I think it's actually, a reasonably informed and a reasonably strategic set of choices that have been made by citizens, by Ukrainian civil society, and by the people who get into power by representing the interests of Ukrainian society and civil society. I think that it's not an accidental drift. It may feel accidental from Europe's point of view because Europe certainly didn't go set about, trying to attract Ukraine to the European Union. In fact, integrating Ukraine into the European Union is an infernally difficult thing to do, and I do hope that it will happen, but it will not be easy, right? So this isn't the result of something I think that Europe was trying to engineer, but it is a rational and a strategically rational response to the differences between the project that Europe offers and has built for itself and the project that Russia offers and has built for itself.
And of course, 2014 was a key inflection point there where Putin, if Mark Gallotta's assessment is correct, then Putin actually doesn't like making difficult decisions and will often defer them and defer them. But it seems 2014 was the sort of crunch point. You either do something about Crimea, you do something about destabilizing Ukraine, or in the Moscow sense, it is lost. And it becomes much harder to then sort of interfere. But if we go back to 2007, it seems that Putin already at that stage has a very different ambition for the world order. And all these other events are quite a number of years beyond that. I mean, okay, the Georgian invasion was 2008, a sort of dress rehearsal for what we saw later. But it seems that Putin has this sense of autocracy or the autocratic order of which Russia is potentially that sort of sees itself as the spiritual heir and representative on earth, sees that in conflict with what we would call, liberal values, which at that point the US would have adhered to, and Europe as well.
Well, look, I hesitate to get into spiritual matters this close to Easter, I suppose. But I think one of the things that we've learned in recent months is that the spirit of autocracy is alive and well in almost any place you can imagine it emerging, and none of us should feel complacent about that. I think again, I tend to see it as a little bit more strategic, although there is certainly an ideological and sort of an identity component to it when it comes to Putin that we've had to become more serious about in recent years. But I think Putin did come to power with a certain imagination of how the world worked. He understood that countries were governed by powerful elites that if you could do business with those elites and find mutually beneficial arrangements, that you could have mutually beneficial relationships that would serve Russia's interests and would serve his interests. I think then two learning processes, and when I say learning, I don't necessarily mean that he learned the truth, but this is the way he has learned to see the world. I think two learning processes occurred from there that got us to sort of 2007, and as you mentioned, and then everywhere we've gone since then. One is that, in fact, he's not dealing with individuals, right? When he's talking to, a President George W. Bush, and then an Obama, and then a Trump, and then a Biden, and then another, well, the same Trump, but another iteration, right? These are transient people, as much as Trump might like to think he might stay on for a very long time, right? And that building a lasting relationship with a system, with institutions, with a political establishment, and with a society is actually much, much more difficult. And that when you have transient leaders coming through these systems, as you do in democracies, there may be a certain instability and discontinuity to that relationship. And so I think he found that to be both frustrating and threatening. And particularly threatening to him, I think, was the fact that as much as he might have felt that he had remember George W. Bush said that he looked into Putin's eyes, saw his soul, or back to the spiritual, right? And felt this was a man that he could work with. At the same time, you had a U.S. administration that seemed to be happy about, the fall of Milosevic in Serbia. That seemed to be happy about the fall of Shevardnadze in the Rose Revolution in Georgia. That seemed to be happy about the fall of the Kuchma-Yanukovych attempt at autocratization in Ukraine, and so on, right? And in fact, that seemed to have a lot of popularity among a growing sort of anti-authoritarian opposition in Russia. And this was despite, right, what Putin may have believed he had earned in terms of sort of respect and trust from an American president. And so he began to find that deeply frustrating and was looking for ways to push back against it. The second thing I think he was learning was that what happens in the region has a direct impact on his ability to rule Russia. Right? So he might, in fact, early on have been reasonably content to take sort of a hands-off approach to affairs in the post-Soviet space, in Ukraine, in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, Belarus, and Moldova, but in fact found that he could not feel secure in his position if he was doing that, right? That dynamics happening on the ground in Ukraine, again, come back to the Orange Revolution, but even just contestation, remember back to the Bronze Soldier incidents in Estonia, even other countries rethinking the sort of the foundational myths of Soviet and then post-Soviet Russian identity were threatening to him and something that he felt he needed to interfere in. And so I think when he went to Munich and essentially announced that Russia needed a sphere of interests and was prepared to defend that sphere of interest geopolitically and maybe eventually militarily, he saw that not just as a defense of empire, but frankly as a defense of his own ability to rule Russia the way that he wanted to rule Russia. And so places like Ukraine, right, where these two dynamics come to a head, right, where you've got a Western, at that point, still a consolidated European and U.S. transatlantic commitment to liberalism and democracy, come into conflict with his unwillingness to countenance political dynamics in the neighborhood that he cannot control. And there was an inevitable recipe for conflict.
It seems as well on reflection that even Putin wasn't fully assured that he could go autocratic. In fact, some of the last vestiges of, say, a more pluralistic society, weren't deconstructed until the context of the full-scale war in Ukraine. Is one of the reasons that he constructed this sort of Sorkovian sort of hybrid autocracy, one which Grigoriev has written about in Spin Dictators. Did he feel the need to sort of construct that rather than a more classical totalitarian system? Is it because it's more efficient to do that? Surely it costs quite a lot to build that kind of media environment, or is it because the sort of Western values had permeated Russia to an extent after the Cold War that he couldn't take Russia back to an authoritarian model quickly or even straight away?
That's a really good question, and I think it's probably a complex answer, although obviously without, having access to Putin's inner thoughts, I'm limited to a certain extent in my analysis. I think you put your finger on one thing earlier, quoting Mark Galeotti, that Putin doesn't like to take big decisions unless he has to, and he does tend to be risk averse. So I think that is part of the instinct. It's odd to think of Putin as risk averse, but he tends to not want to change something unless he can see that it's sort of incontrovertibly broken and can't be fixed. Because you never know what the consequences of those changes are going to be, right? And you don't want to risk creating a dynamic that you then can't control. That said, I don't think that, Gruyev and Tradesman's book, which you mentioned, Spin Dictators, was written on the basis of what Putin had achieved, right? And Putin's model in Russia really is the core model that underpins their theory. It wasn't available as a textbook for him to start for him to follow when he started, right? So I think he was, again, learning as he went along. We know that Putin privileges autonomy of the state and doesn't really distinguish between autonomy of the state and his autonomy to make decisions. Um, he always wants the state to have a free hand to act, which means he always wants himself to have a free hand to act. So he came into power and looked around and said, okay, what are the things that are limiting me? Well, television is limiting me, right? The commanding heights of media, and you think back to 2000, this was still a television age very much, particularly in Russia, where internet penetration was still lagging behind the West. So he starts with that. He goes after Gusinski, and Berezovsky takes over the main television stations. Okay, that's done, right? But then you look around and say, okay, well, I'm still being limited by these pesky political parties in the Duma that are independent. So I need to rejigger the way that works. And then I'm being limited by oligarchs who own important parts of the economy. So Khodorkovsky needs to be made an example of in order to get people in line. And then, well, there's these directly elected governors who seem to think they have their own power base and they can challenge me. So I've got to do something about that, right? And then it's civil society more broadly, right? That we look at the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and see that people can come seemingly out of nowhere to occupy really the kind of almost not just the physical space of cities, but just sort of the psychic space of the population, and that can make it very difficult to feel autonomous as a leader. So you've got to do something about that, and you have the genesis of what would eventually become the laws on foreign agents and undesirable organizations, really going back to the immediate aftermath of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And then you say, actually, television isn't enough. The internet now is a thing, right? You look at the Arab Spring and the use of social media in mobilization. So we need to clamp down on that as well. So it has been an evolving appetite for control from his side, even if it has always been driven, I think, by the same basic instinct. I think you're right, though, that there has been a desire. I mean, look, they have gone further and faster in repression than I think, if I were taking a rational approach, than I think would have been necessary. Right? I think they have tended to overestimate the scale of the challenges that they could face from society and from an anti-authoritarian opposition. But it's in their clear incentive to overestimate that, right? Because if I get the calculation wrong and they get pulled down in a regime in a revolution, well, maybe I'm kind of happy about it as a human being, but also as an analyst, I feel a little silly. But the consequences don't go beyond that for me, right? The consequences for Putin of getting that calculation wrong are rather more catastrophic, and so he is going to overestimate those sorts of things. And overreact sort of preventively to threats as he sees them emerge. But it is, and I think you were pointing at this as well, true that full-on totalitarian repression is expensive. You have to create a repressive and a coercive apparatus that needs to be fed, that needs to be kept under control, that needs to be given consistent reasons to remain loyal and focused, and that can, in and of itself, become a threat over time. But that is also, if you look at the Soviet experience, tends to degrade over time, right? That people begin to sort of fall into the routines when you know where the clear red lines are, right? Then people can walk right up to them and be reasonably confident that they won't get hit on the head. Whereas in the kind of more nuanced autocracy that Putin has put together, one of the effects of that is that everybody's always kept guessing. You never know where the red lines are. You can find yourself on the wrong side of the red line accidentally, which means you inculcate a very real sense of risk aversion amongst the population, amongst the elite who might be minded to challenge you, amongst the opposition. And I think they found that that's been broadly pretty effective. So again, if it's not broke, they're not going to fix it.
And the interventions are fairly surgical. Now, we don't know, let's say, what happened to Vladimir Tatarsky or numerous others, or Daria Dugina, whether that's Ukraine or whether actually that is an internal correcting mechanism to say, okay, you've gone a little bit off script there. Let's just make a little example and make sure everyone sees what's happening. Do you think history is going to look at this and there's going to be a bit of a reset and say, Putin caused huge bloodbath in his foreign policy, but actually in terms of internal repression, it was relatively surgical. And indeed, the scale of opposition, serious opposition, impactful opposition that he came up with was shockingly minimal.
I think you're right on both of those things. If you look at the biggest and most concerted protest wave that Putin has faced, this is going back to the Bolotnaya protest, 2011, 2012. Um, the police were there, but they mostly stood on the sidelines and just did sort of minimal crowd control until the final act in May of 2012, which was, reasonably violent. People were arrested, people were hurt. It became more violent over time. So we saw increasing violence through protests 2017 and then 2019, and then it was actually quite violent in 2021. But for example, if you were to compare it to the way in which US police forces dealt with Black Lives Matter, right, it's actually quite peaceable. It's also quite peaceable compared to the way that the Belarusians treated the opposition with Russian support in 2020 in the protests around the elections that year, or the way that the Kazakhs treated the uprising in December 21, January 22, or indeed the way that the Yanukovych regime tried to suppress the Euromaidan in 2013-14. In fact, it's notable that Medvedev was president. Well, sorry, no, he was prime minister still in Russia at the time, was encouraging Yanukovych to be more violent. And the Kremlin encouraged Lukashenko to be violent and encouraged Tokayev to be violent to a degree that they would not risk at home. Right? You can read into that what you will in terms of the dynamics they may have been trying to create in those other places. But I think there is a calculation and understanding that, violence is difficult to do right. You can create a backlash, as Yanukovych learned in Ukraine, as Mubarak learned in Egypt, and frankly, as Lukashenko learned in Belarus. Right? You can create a greater backlash, which eventually can overwhelm you. And I think that's one of the reasons why they have tried, as you said, to use violence reasonably surgically. Now, is that surgical response the reason that you don't have a more consolidated opposition in Russia? Partly. Right? So oppositions and protest waves are emotional things, right? And they are brought together by a sense of threat and sort of a sense that of sort of now or never, right? That if we don't act, we may never have the opportunity again because the regime is becoming so repressive. And I think that the fact that the regime in Russia has been reasonably careful not to give people that sense of pervasive threat and imminence is one of the reasons why you haven't seen a consolidated opposition. But I think there are broader and deeper reasons than that. Right? It is actually pretty difficult to find people in Russia who think that the country is well governed. Right? Most people in Russia understand that Putin governs in a very self-interested way, in ways that serve his elite. Right now, people are reasonably, I think, cowed by what's going on with foreign policy, that they sort of begin to see that as somewhat in their interest as well. But people understand that governance in Russia is corrupt. And, so the challenge for the opposition has actually never been to convince people that the regime is repressive or that the regime is corrupt. People understand that. The challenge has been to convince people that if you were to engage in a democratic process, you would get a regime that would be appreciably better. There is basically nothing in Russian living memory going back to the late Soviet period that would suggest that a change of power can bring a significant benefit for your livelihoods. Most people, even when they do willingly and gladly vote for Putin, and even when they're optimistic about the future, they tend to assign that optimism to things that they're doing, right? That I'm getting a new job, I'm moving to a new city, I'm getting better education, I'm finding these opportunities, and the most I want from the state is just to stay out of my way. And Putin has been really relatively good at keeping the state out of people's way, with increasing friction recently, but still he's been reasonably skilled at that. But Russia has never had, until right now, a public conversation about what the purpose of Russia is, right? About what it means to be Russia in the world and what it means to be Russian in Russia, right? Depending on how you want to define any of those terms. Whereas, Ukraine, for example, emerged from the Soviet Union, first of all, with a memory of resistance and desire for autonomy. and then had a very robust and a very difficult public conversation, right? It continues to have that conversation about what it means for there to be a Ukraine on the world stage, what it means to be a citizen of Ukraine, which means that there is more than just a material aspect to politics. There is a moral and an identitarian aspect to politics. That is something Yeltsin never wanted to have anything to do with, right? Yeltsin said the only thing we need is democracy and capitalism, and didn't do either of those things terribly well, right? But tried, and that's not much to go on in terms of an identity, right? It's not much to debate in terms of a political system and a political conversation. Putin similarly tried very hard to avoid ideology until he really didn't have a choice in about 2012 when he started to introduce all of this sort of traditional values and anti-LGBTQ and pro-religious sentiment and that sort of thing, but also in a way that was really designed to avoid debate, right? That was designed more to suppress debate than to create a conversation about what it means to be Russia. And certainly, things are much more focused on identity and patriotism and nationalism now than they ever have been at any point since the end of the Soviet Union. But again, in a way that is not about having a conversation, right? It's a monologue, and so I think it is very difficult to see. We can see all the moral reasons why we might think that Russians ought to be on the streets, but if we take this from a dispassionate social science perspective, sort of the prerequisites for that kind of mobilization simply aren't really there.
And this is an interesting one, isn't it? I wasn't going to sort of go here, but when cultures such as Ukraine have a sort of pride or have that active dialogue, then their culture becomes something that can be evangelized and shared, and it can actually bounce off other cultures and get stimulation from it. Whereas it does seem that the Russian cultural exports are much more wielded in the fashion of a weapon that is not seeking influence from outside. Again, that maybe reflects how the state supports it, and the sort of people who enter those positions within the sort of hierarchy. They have to buy into a more, say, imperialistic thing. And this is a very sort of vague question, but it just sort of triggered me thinking there's a very different way in which Russian culture is exported compared to how Ukrainians are trying to export theirs.
Well, it's a question of who's doing the exporting and who's choosing, right? I think that governments, generally speaking, aren't very good, right, at picking um, and marketing cultural exports. Some are better than others, right? But it tends to come off as pretty ham-handed, and politicians are risk averse in terms of the things that they want to promote, right? We know, for example, the U.S. was actually reasonably successful in promoting jazz, right? And a lot of African American culture in the in the Soviet space during the Cold War, but had to do it in a way that was clandestine even from its own population, because we're talking about a period in which a lot of Americans thought we shouldn't be we should be exporting Frank Sinatra and not Louis Armstrong, right? That sort of thing. Certainly not Miles Davis or somebody who might have countercultural ideas. So it is something that's much better done when it's done by individuals, right? And despite all of the um, uh, antipathy towards Russia and Russians that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has evoked, and understandably so, what we do see is that Russian authors and journalists, Russian theater directors and playwrights and movie actors, right, who have uh, taken themselves out of Putin's political project, right, who have taken themselves physically out of that project and put themselves in Europe and other places, are actually very much in demand, right, and are able to produce really critical cultural value, right, that resonates in difficult conversations, but resonates with audiences in Europe and potentially even with some audiences among Ukrainians. So it is not that there is, I think, something inherently wrong with the ability of Russians to produce culture, right? So much as an attempt to pick a sort of an ideologically useful culture and make sure that you are exporting that, right, and only that, and using it in a way that, again, is designed not to create a cultural conversation or an intercultural conversation, but to prevent that conversation. It's when Russia says, this is Russian culture and you must be part of it. You are part of the Russian world, even if you think of yourself as Ukrainian or Belarusian or what have you. And thus, there is only one brand of literature. There is only one brand of Orthodox Christianity. There is only one interpretation of history, right, that can be countenanced, right? That is perfectly designed to create resistance.
Well, we could probably have several episodes just on that, and maybe in future we'll get the chance to. Let's turn back to the geopolitics of things, because you wrote something really interesting on LinkedIn, and unfortunately, this seems to be coming to pass. You said that if there are any inconsistency in three pillars of US foreign policy, support for Ukraine, resistance to Russia, and partnership with Europe, if any one of those pillars was to start to wobble, then Europe would look at the US as no longer being a reliable partner. And the flip side of that is that totalitarians would feel empowered, and Russia itself would perhaps feel more entitled to either interfere or feel that the Eurasian space is part of its sphere of influence or even sort of domain of control. Unfortunately, under Trump, all three of these pillars have not just wobbled. They are in something of a catastrophic, let's say, state of disbalance.
So I think I wrote that actually, if I recall, right after President Biden announced he was going to withdraw from the race. Um, Anticipating that, there would be a change even if there was a Harris administration, from a Biden administration to a Harris administration when it came to foreign policy. But I anticipated, frankly, more continuity even from a Trump administration than we've gotten. I think you're putting it too kindly to say that they are faltering. They are being actively attacked, right? These three.
Yes, eroded with the
Um,
sledgehammer. Yeah.
Not my definition of erosion, right? They are. We have an administration in the U.S. It is not isolationist, right? We have an administration in the U.S. that is transactionalist, that looks at the world as a place to do business for the purpose of maximizing immediate benefit. Right? And we can have a conversation about, to whom that benefit accrues and what the form of that benefit is. Right? But leaving that aside, right? That's the approach that they're taking. And there are lots of, first of all, the U.S. has always been able to transact in the world and has been, all countries can be transactional, right? But the U.S. has historically also felt that it has durable interests, that those interests need to be maintained over time. Otherwise, they risk creating much greater costs for the United States down the road, and that the management of those interests requires allies and durable relationships, and has spent decades, better part of a century, building those relationships and those alliances. Only now to find that we have an administration that finds those relationships and alliances to be limiting, that those relationships require a certain amount of consistency from the US, and that means that there are costs associated with the transactions that the administration would rather not have to pay. And so I think is seeking to, at the very least, loosen those constraints, if not, in fact, to withdraw the United States from as many of these sorts of relationships as possible, to give the administration the freedom to transact at the lowest possible cost and with the lowest possible consequence for U.S. interests as they see it. Again, short-term, situational, transactional interests. And that, I think, is a large part of the reason why the administration is looking to normalize its relationship with Russia. A large part of the reason why it sees the conflict in Ukraine as something it simply wishes were not happening, regardless of how it ends, and sees the relationship with Europe as particularly problematic.
And that's not necessarily dissimilar to how Biden saw it. I'm not sure that Sullivan Biden ever fully got behind the idea of anything approaching Ukrainian victory and would have,
Respectfully, I think it's a very, 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 very different set of circumstances.
yes, but they'd
So,
prefer it not to be happening. I mean, they
well,
wanted it to
everybody
go
would prefer
away.
a war not to be happening, with the possible exception of Vladimir Putin, right? But um, you are absolutely right that the Biden administration, and frankly, no European government, right, has set its aims vis-a-vis the war as entirely coincident with Ukraine's, right? And it would be difficult to expect them to do otherwise, because Ukraine, at the end of the day, will make its own decisions about what it wants to pursue in this war, obviously shaped by the level of support that it does or does not get from the West. But it is up to the people of Ukraine and their elected representatives how long and to what ends they want to fight. So any Western government will always maintain a degree of distance, at least rhetorically, right, in order to avoid a situation in which, for example, the government in Kiev said, actually, we need to conquer Moscow in order to be secure, right? And then you would expect most Western governments to say, actually, sorry, we can't help you with that, right? Aside from that, and alongside that, right? Yes, there was a risk-averse approach, right, from the Biden administration. The Biden administration was overwhelmingly concerned with preventing a catastrophic escalation of this war into nuclear conflagration. Again, not an entirely unreasonable concern, but I think that my own analysis is that they overestimated the risks of that and underestimated the degree to which, in fact, Russia was behaving as though it itself was deterred by the prospect of escalation with the West. But I think that they made their calculations from an honest place, right? So I disagree with the analysis that they had, but I understand how they came by it, and I think they came by it honestly. At the same time, with the sort of caveat that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a catastrophically unilateral move, right? You had an administration, including Biden, including Blinken, including Sullivan, that was both multilateralist and transatlanticist to its core, right? That believed in Europe, that believed that, in fact, the US could not achieve anything meaningful without not just European participation, but in fact, a sense of European agency. And I think that's why we saw, ahead of the full-scale invasion, when Washington knew that the war was coming, unprecedented level of intelligence sharing, an unprecedented level of work with the Europeans to develop really an unprecedented European response in terms of the scale and the rapidity of sanctions in February and March of 2022. And a willingness really to work in a lot of ways behind the scenes rather than to be out front, in a Trumpian way, cajoling, to borrow a term from Obama, to lead from behind a little bit, right? To push the Germans to take the leadership, to push the French to be out there saying, this is unconscionable from a European perspective. I've got all kinds of other beefs with the Biden administration. I don't think they explained the war well to the American public. I don't think that, again, as we've discussed, that their analysis on the escalatory dynamics was correct. But it's hard to imagine a more different set of foreign policy postures and values from one administration to the next than we've had from the Biden administration to the Trump administration.
Indeed, absolutely. But one of the consistent things as well, this is Ben Hodges, mentioned this back in 2022 when I first interviewed him. He said that the costs of dealing with this are only going to rise if we kick the can down the road. And now we're at the point, and again, he got some fascinating comments on our social profiles about this, that Europe had the choice whether to mobilize now or later, and doing anything later comes at much greater cost and much more strategic risk. Even at this point, where we're 5 minutes to midnight or whatever it happens to be, does Europe have the political will to actually defend not just Ukraine, but itself?
My response to that is that when it comes to European political will, I am cautiously not apocalyptic. This is a particularly difficult moment for Europe, right? Everybody is still dealing with the consequences of Brexit, right? And for better or for worse, Britain was always the clearest geopolitical voice in Brussels. Um, Germany is waiting to have a government. Poland has impending elections. France has a government, but in many ways might as well not. Um, uh, you have two governments in Bratislava and Budapest that are actively working to undermine the coherence of the union and the power of the Commission. You have a third and much more potentially influential government in Rome that, for the moment, is not doing so, but sort of reserves the right politically and ideologically to tack in that direction if they find it useful. And we could go on. Politics in Europe is complicated. Um, so there are all kinds of reasons why this is difficult. Um, at the same time, we have a European Defence Commissioner and centralized European defence funding for the first time in history. You have senior leadership in the Commission, really across the patch, from the president of the Commission through to the High Representative and the Defence Commissioner, and in fact the French uh, um, essentially industry and economics commissioner, competitiveness commissioner, who are all on the same page geopolitically, right, and are committed to both European defense and to Ukraine.
And indeed, Britain may become part of that procurement process if Starmer and
It
his
may, right,
diplomatic
right.
skills succeed.
Yeah. And sort of the one thing that's going right for Starmer at the moment, right, is working with Europe on foreign policy. At the same time, you now have Finland and Sweden in NATO, right, which adds again seriousness and capacity. Um, the problem is that even if Europe was gradually coming to terms with the idea that the US might not be part of the solution in Ukraine, it was not materially or emotionally prepared for the prospect that the US might actively become part of the problem. And I think that a lot of the reticence that we're seeing is predicated on the idea that if Trump wants a deal at any cost in Ukraine that badly, right, and simply wants something cleared away so that he can normalize relations with Russia, and that is his aim, that he has more than enough levers at his disposal to undermine European security quite catastrophically if Europe decides to put its own force in the defense of Ukraine, if that means picking a fight with the United States. So again, while it's difficult, and I read partly rather they weren't doing it, I understand why even Macron, right, who's in a position to be and has historically been, the most in favor of sort of an anti-American view of European strategic autonomy, is still trying to keep Trump on board, right, or at least trying to keep him going fully off the deep end. I do worry, though, that time is running out to do this at reasonable cost. I do think that there is an opportunity for Europe to create a deterrence in Ukraine that would mean, look, we are headed most likely to some kind of a ceasefire. It is likely to be a bad ceasefire, one that Russia will at some point want to violate. Right? So the question is, can Europe create some sort of a deterrent that means that Russia will face uh, consequences that are difficult to calculate and potentially quite severe military consequences if it violates that ceasefire? I do think that is possible, right? Whether that's boots on the ground or planes in the sky or robust missile defense or something or some combination of all three. There are options on the table. But the moment the ceasefire takes hold, if that force is not ready to go, right, it becomes very, very difficult to impose it later because the Russians will simply say, well, any European intervention is, Ukraine and NATO by the back door, and thus, reason for renewed violence. And so it will be politically very difficult for Europeans to take that step.
And that opens a whole vista of challenges, confrontation, complexity over, well, as long as Putin remains alive, one would have thought these problems won't go away, and that's one of the challenges. His longevity, the longevity of his regime, equals, instability geopolitically.
It does, right, regardless of where this goes, right? Because if this goes in a direction in which um, if this goes in a direction in which the war in a hot or a cold form continues, right, then obviously Europe's eastern flank will remain unstable. In some ways, if the war ends, right, more or less incontrovertibly without an incontrovertible Russian defeat, um, then we are in a world in which not only Putin feels emboldened, right? We're in a world in which, well, if Russia can redraw the border of Ukraine, why can't the US redraw the border of Denmark or Canada or Panama, right? To say nothing of China. Um, and that is not particularly a world that I want to live in, right? Is Look, I think a lot of us understood from the beginning of this war that how it ends will have consequences that go far beyond Europe, that it will shape the incentives that other great powers see for themselves. They will either feel that there is a world order. I'm allergic to the phrase rules-based world order because I'm not sure it really has ever been that, right? But there is either an order that includes the maxim that you simply do not reshape other people's borders through military force. Um, that is either an order that is capable of defending itself, or it's not. And if it's not, then well, why should we stick to this quaint, 20th century notion that we don't go to war over borders, right? I got an army, there's a border, I want it, I'm just going to take it. We've seen the Venezuelans play around with this. We have seen the Chinese play around with this, and I think it was difficult for us to imagine that. It was difficult for me to imagine that the U.S. would go in that direction, right? But I think we have to understand this is part of the same process.
Sam, I know we're out of time on this. Thank you so much for being so generous with your insights and your time today. I know the audience will put tremendous value on that, and there's so much to pick through in this conversation. For now, though, thank you so much.
Thank you.